Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. No. We now have time for some Q&A. If you have a question, please make your way to a microphone.
Hi. Hi, Mr. No. Thank you for your comments, and you're a very brave man. My question has to do with, we often hear, and I was wondering if you could tell us the truth of whether people with money, AKA George Soros and things like that, I always hear that they're involved and are financing behind the scenes. Do you know if that is for sure true, or if they are just taking advantage of circumstances?
So that's the question that I, when I was writing my book, sought to answer. I wanted to find out where the money is coming from. That's the question that I had been asked most frequently over the past couple of years, and it was something I was curious about myself. And the answer is, I found no evidence that there are any big, shadowy millionaire, billionaire figures funding the actual militant Antifa violence on the streets. The money that they do get, which is significant, actually is done pretty much out in the open. They create campaigns on GoFundMe to raise bail money in legal funds. They establish ad hoc front groups to gather those funds and to launder it to their causes. They also create accounts on Cash App, Venmo, or PayPal. These are some of the apps and sites where you can donate money, small amounts. And the amounts add up to hundreds of thousands. In the case of Portland, the Portland Bail Fund, which was one of these Antifa front groups raising money for all the rioters arrested, raised more than $1.3 million. In Minneapolis, tens of millions of dollars was raised, in part with the help of our current vice president, for accused rioters in Minneapolis, as well as those accused of murder and other heinous crimes. So, efforts to think that you could topple the one funding source to cut them off, it's not simple like that. Big tech has not been putting much effort into shutting down these accounts and pages because it's masked in a way, right? Like with a group name that sounds as innocuous as the Portland Defense Fund, you wouldn't think that these are far-left extremists who are raising money for people charged with felony assault and arson and other crimes.
Question to the speaker's left.
Hi, I live in the greater Seattle area, and we watched on TV the riots that happened. My question is, if you pull off the masks of these people, who are they?
Great question. So if people follow me on my Twitter, one of the projects I've been doing for almost a year now is in the Portland area, because there's been so many arrests in Portland, I will actually do the public records request to get the booking photos, the names and charges. And you'll see that there's really no one type of Antifa. There are a couple of things that generally you can say. They lean young. You have some people who are young as 15 years old getting arrested to those in their early 30s. Slightly more men than women involved. Disproportionately people who identify as transgender. At some point I would like to write on this more, but I believe it's because the transgender ideology is a political ideology that's very radical. So that's why you're seeing an overrepresentation in those involved in far left activities. Some of them are people in very white-collar jobs. There's been registered nurses and attorneys who have been arrested. One of the staffers for the Speaker of the House for the state of Oregon was arrested at a riot. There's many, many students, of course, and even faculty in academia who's been arrested at these riots. And another thing is that many of them are homeless or otherwise very vulnerable populations of people. And I write about in my book that there's a sympathy I feel for many of them, because these are people who, they want community, and this Antifa extremist movement ideology gives them that community, it gives them meaning and purpose. It does a lot of things of like what religion traditionally would do, but it also leads them down a path towards violence, and some of them get seriously injured in the process of them trying to fight police or assault people, and then they're just kind of discarded. It's a very wicked and destructive movement and ideology, but I'm not sure what it will take for the public to wake up and realize this threat to America that comes from this group. I think sometimes they're easily dismissed as weak soy boys and soy girls on the street who don't know what they're doing. That's partially true, but you don't have to be strong to stab somebody. You don't have to be strong to have a pistol in your pocket and shoot somebody dead. So the right does underestimate Antifa.
Questions to the speaker's right.
Yes. First, thank you for the courage that you've shown. Secondly, I just read that the mayor of Portland is asking people to turn Antifa people in, and I wondered what your response to that would be. And another quick question, what is the relationship between Black Lives Matter and Antifa?
Portland Mayor Ted Wheeler is serving his second term. He was elected at the beginning, or he came into office at the beginning of 2017, and it was under his watch that Antifa grew to become the existential threat that it is today to Portland. For going back several years now, he gave them the legitimacy to do what they do, and he restricted and tied the ability for police to respond, because he's also the police commissioner. He serves a dual role. And he did all that because of his blind hatred of Trump, which he made very, very clear, which is not unique to him. Many Democrat elected officials hate Trump more than they love their own communities and their fellow citizens. With him doing the 180 now, it's too little, too late. I mean, he was instrumental last year in pushing for the police department to be defunded. It was under his leadership that the gun violence reduction team in Portland Police was abolished, and now we have record high numbers of shootings and homicides. And so he's pleading with the public to essentially help police with some of their investigations. Yet the city will offer you no help if in the course of you trying to photograph suspicious individuals in your neighborhood, you get assaulted or a rock thrown through your window, as happened a few days ago. Will anybody come to protect you? The city certainly won't. So, too little, too late, I say. Regarding Black Lives Matter, in my writings, I usually link BLM and Antifa. I describe them really as a single entity. But what people should know is they are different in their ultimate goals. Antifa, as I said, is anarchist communist, whereas BLM is just straight communist. And so these differences are meaningful, and ultimately, if they were to be successful in their destruction of America, it would lead to infighting. One group or the other will win. But for now, they work together in the form of Antifa providing security at these BLM demonstrations that also turn into riots. What I was seeing in Portland and other cities last year with the mass looting is that the Antifa would be the first to break the windows, to breach the doors or windows of the building, and then sort of unleash the opportunists to loot and destroy businesses. And then once that's done, they'll just go in and start a fire and destroy what's left. So the relationship is mutually beneficial because of a shared hatred of the United States. I think you can tell the difference between somebody who is a critic versus somebody who's an enemy. If you listen to what BLM activists and what Antifa say, obviously they fall in the latter.
Question to the speaker's left.
Thank you, Andy, for being here today. My question is, there are also international groups that are similar, and what are the numbers internationally and domestically that fall into this type of organization?
Yeah, so this is a question that really is almost impossible to answer, in that it's the same way to ask, like, how many Muslim extremists are there in the world? It's like the delineations is often not clear. You don't have to be a card-carrying member. You don't have to have trained in Syria or Iraq with IS to actually be a member. So who actually fits that? I think there's similar issue with Antifa when you're trying to find out how many members they are. You have to look at it, if you want to know numbers, you have to look at it more maybe group by group, like Rose City Antifa, which has, from my estimates, less than 100 people who are actually involved. Relatively, their numbers are actually small, but they're able to do so much damage because they have a lot of wider support in the mainstream left. I mean, you can look at our papers of record, the commentaries that they print, and those who go on broadcast television to excuse far-left political violence, to argue that destruction and looting and arson is not actually violence, or that it's justified in the name of racial justice. So it's this tacit support from the wider left that gives them the ability to do what they do. You know, you can, in conservative areas where there are elected politicians who are responsible and recognize the threat that Antifa poses to the public, they don't allow them to build the networks to destabilize the city. But when you're in an area like Portland or Seattle or the Bay Area or Philadelphia, there's wide support for it.
Question to the speaker's right.
The threat of violence or death is real. And two things. One, you mentioned about Seattle and Portland being pretty much done. I was in Indianapolis recently, and I was having a talk with a police officer, and he said, we are told to stand down. Arson is not a crime, basically. I mean, it's not to be prosecuted. Only if it is a human's life is at stake. That's number one. And number two, one of your comment about the stand down orders from mayors and chiefs of police, but also you had kind of brought it up. It's not just a little bit of Antifa and a huge majority of people against Antifa. There's a huge middle section, a big middle section of citizens that are going, it's just for racial justice and it's peaceful protests. You had made some comments. I'd love to hear more comments about this middle section of people. I think they need to get active with their elected representatives, like strongly, and say, hey, no, this is not going to be in our city.
I said earlier in the speech that this, at least in urban left-wing areas, this is really a fight for liberals and the moderate left. But even in the rare instances where they've tried to voice their opposition, for example, in Seattle, in the area of the former so-called Chaz, there has continued to be weekly violence there by Antifa, and a association of business owners and residents in the area wrote a letter to the mayor asking for a restoration of law and order, and the response from Antifa was to release the personal information of every person who signed that letter. That has resulted in the public being very, very afraid to speak out. So, Antifa, they don't just do the street hooliganism. It's threats and intimidation and harassment. And for the average working person, that's just not the type of, they can't deal with that type of onslaught. And I wish that politicians like Mayor Wheeler and others had woken up to this threat, but they chose to empower it, and it's not really them who will suffer. I mean, Wheeler's from a very wealthy background. He will retire and have a good life. It's the people in Portland who don't have the money to leave. I'm very privileged that I got my resources together to leave, as painful and difficult as that's been. But it's the people stuck in the cities who have to deal with the political consequences.
Question to the speaker's left.
I'd like to say, first of all, thank you again for your courage and boldness. I'd like to pray for God's protection and healing for you physically and emotionally. It must have been, we can't imagine what you've been through. But my question has to do with the history of nonviolent resistance to evil in our country. Going back to the 50s and 60s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and that whole tradition of nonviolence. Are there no churches? Are there no Christians? Is there no one left in this country who was inspired by Dr. King to stand between this evil and those that it seeks to destroy?
I think the heroes of the past that are lauded now by the current left, the figures that they pick tells us a lot. They don't uphold the memory and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. They celebrate people like Assata Shakur, a wanted felon and an enemy of America who fled to Cuba after her involvement in killing a state trooper in New Jersey. They uphold Malcolm X. They uphold Black Panthers. They reject the tradition of nonviolent civil disobedience because they see how effective threats and violence actually are. I mean, in my view, they held the entire country under threat of mass violence and death and destruction if they didn't get the outcome in the trial that they wanted regarding Chauvin. Again, this transformation in the left has been happening slowly since the last century. Started in academia. If you go back to 2015, I was kind of troubled that a lot of people on the right dismissed the campus rage stuff as just kind of a joke, that the screaming and the crying and the extremism on campuses is something to be mocked and it's just going to go away. Well, the students went on to graduate. They work in administration now. They go on to be on city councils. They run for government. And you can see the drastic effect it has had on culture and politics in just 5 years. That's going to continue. I don't think that the issues we're facing now are going to go away with a different administration. I mean, even with the previous administration, there wasn't really much that Trump could do to counter what has happened in journalism, in local governments, in academia. I just feel like with the current administration, that process of decline is just sped up, but it is going to happen regardless.
We have time for one final question.
Oh, great. Andy, big fan of yours. I've been following you for several years, and God bless your heart for doing such great work. So my question is a little different, and I guess I'm looking for some optimism here. I really need it. In your work all over the country and talking to people all over the place, I sort of personally get a sense that there are all these little militias out there forming to take our country back. Do you ever hear anything about that? Of course, I'm from the South, so I might hear things differently than other people do. We're not going to go down softly, let me tell you that. But seriously, do you ever hear any undercurrent of discontent with the conservatives that are ready to put up or shut up?